Welcome to the Loins of History. My name is Jay. I'm joined by my co-host Colin. We're going to continue talking this week about the Cultural Revolution and how that impacts today. So, yeah, without further ado, Colin, take us away on our key takeaways.
Thanks, Jay. So we got three key takeaways for this episode. The first one is Mao's cultural revolution that he began really utilized the youth and lower classes in this bottom-up type of revolution, and really it was him co-opting them in order to achieve his political goals and within the party. And then the second one is Mao used the chaos of the Red Guards to bring about the party transformation. So within his own party, not just within society as a whole, but those Red Guards really brought transformation to his party, which is one of his other political goals. And in order to gain control of the country toward the end of 1968, the Red Guards were eventually forced out into the countryside in this down to the countryside movement, and the PLA actually had to take control of the country. So China essentially operated under martial law from about 1968 to 1971 just to regain control of the country because so much chaos had broken out. So with those key takeaways in mind, let's start with how the Cultural Revolution kicked off. And we transitioned from this socialist education movement led by Liao Xiao Chi.
Real briefly, just want to interject. The phases of the Cultural Revolution and what we're going to talk about this episode, right? There was from 66 to 68-ish, there was the radical phase, right? Where Mao, the Red Guards, they created chaos. There were various massacres. They were trying to kick out all the bourgeoisie elements. Then starting in 68 to 70, 71, there was this okay, the radical elements of the party are in control. And up until, all the way through 76, it was a very low-key, radicals are running the country. Mao's like, okay, thanks, radicals. And then he died. And we're going to talk about those first two, right? This episode.
Yeah, no, it's actually a very good synopsis. We'll just end the episode. if you have to think about it.
Thanks, folks, for joining us this week.
Shortest episode yet. That's a good way to think about it. Within the 66 to 68, it was, I think Frank Decoder said, Mao was not in control, but he was in charge. And that's kind of this bottom-up idea where he sort of just unleashed these lower classes and these, the urban youths and educated youths. And then, the 68 to 71, it was like, all right, I've got everything I need now. I'm going to put the PLA in charge and we're going to enforce the changes we've made. And then kind of calmed down toward the latter third before he died. But
the radicals were still in charge. That's why we say the Cultural Revolution lasted until 76. Anyway, I just wanted to give that big picture. We're only going to talk about really the first half or the first 2/3 in this episode. So Colin, how did the Cultural Revolution start?
So let's start with Liao Xiao Chi and his socialist education movement. If we remember from last week, that was where he was in charge with kind of the reverse of what we just mentioned in the key takeaways, this top down. We're going to send party members out to the countryside. We are going to bring socialism to these peasants. We're going to mentor them. We are going to start these emulation campaigns. We're going to reach out to these different, we're going to try within the military, within education, within the arts, we're going to try and influence people from the top. I also think we need to keep in mind that within that secret speech back in 1956, and keep going back to this, where Khrushchev broke from traditional communism and socialism thought and began to a revisionist path, that was still always in the mind of Mao, especially when it came to Liao Xiao Chi, what he was doing during his socialist education movement, because he believed that Liao Xiao Chi was turning into a revisionist. And Liao Xiao Chi was his heir apparent. Since 1961, he had been his heir apparent. And if we look at it, there was this one key moment where there's an opera that took place in 1965 called Hai Rui, Dismissed from Office. And it was basically, long story short, this set in the Ming Dynasty where this noble elitist comes down and saves these helpless peasants. Where Yao Yanwen criticized the play. And in 1966, early 1966, Mao had actually commissioned a group called the Group of Five, led by the mayor of Beijing. And what they were supposed to do was take a look at beginning a cultural revolution, what they would do, what they would recommend. Well, Mayor Beijing did not like Yao Wenyan criticizing the opera. He felt like he made it too political because he, in his critique, came after Wuhan, not the city of Wuhan, but a member of the CCP named Wuhan. And that actually upset him quite a bit because he came after a member of the CCP party and publicly criticized him. Well, they came out with a report, and Mao did not like what the report said. He felt like it was too revisionist, too rightist, not revolutionary enough. And so this is kind of serves as this moment on May 16th, where they released this document on May 16th. And in this document, he sends out a notification about the themes of Cultural Revolution. It was initially a secret party memo that was released, and they condemned rightists and revisionists. So if you're Liao Xiao Chi, a member of this Group of Five, this was kind of a warning shot that they're coming after you, because Mao took a look at these events, this critique of an opera, because he believed the arts had become too bourgeoisie. They didn't have enough revolutionary message. He looked at Liao Xiao Chi and his socialist education movement as being too slow, too soft, not revolutionary enough, not achieving his aims. So he kind of utilized this critique by Yao Wenyan as a way to manipulate that into his aims of a cultural revolution. So when he released this memo, I'm going to read a quote from it. And it was fairly lengthy, but this is one key paragraph. Quote, "Those representatives of the bourgeoisie have sneaked into the party, the government, the army, various cultural circles are a bunch of counter-revolutionary revisionists. Once conditions are ripe, they will seize political power and turn the dictatorship of the proletariat into a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Some of them we have already seen. Others we have not. Some are still trusted by us and are being trained as our successors. Persons like Khrushchev, for example, who are still nestling beside us. Party committees at all levels must pay full attention to this matter." A couple key things from this quote. Notice how he calls out our successors in Khrushchev. Liao Xiao Chi was leading this socialist education movement. He was the heir apparent, like Khrushchev was the heir to Stalin, and he was considered a revisionist. This is him looking at, I read this as him directing this at Liao Xiao Chi and saying, "You are my successor, but you're a revisionist, and I don't like what you're doing. You're not radical enough. You're not socialist enough." Because if we remember, Mao is almost more like Trotsky and Lenin in the sense that he truly believes in this communist socialist worldwide revolution, and that this is, he was not a pragmatist in any sense. He'll kill millions in order to achieve his goals, his socialist goals, no compromise. Whereas Liao Xiao Chi and Deng Xiaoping were much more moderate, and that's what we saw, where they kind of sidelined Mao and like, we got to get the country back on track. He didn't like that. And this was Mao's moment to pull the rug out from under these men. And they end up actually under house arrest in 1967. But this is where it began. And if you remember from last week, we talked about how the Little Red Book and a lot of this Maoist thought and cult of personality had not only infiltrated the military through Lin Biao, but also education and the emulation campaigns that I mentioned in the key takeaways. Be like Li Fang. Mao had, even though he was sidelined from making administrative decisions, was still an ideological and philosophical leader. And he had this cult of personality cultivated around the youth of China. So he was fanatically worshipped by these young educated classes. So when he came out with this, he basically gave them the green light to start committing this revolution. And it kicks off in the summer of 1966. Like, this is where it starts getting chaotic with what's called the Red Guards. So the Red Guards were these revolutionary urban educated youths, and they actually started at Tsinghua University. What these factions were these sons and daughters of cadre members of the CCP. And most of them were obviously very well educated, actually probably better off than the average Chinese peasant or just member of society at that age, in that age demographic.
Like Antifa.
Bingo. Exactly. And we're actually going to see they have a lot of similarities, especially when they start factionalizing. So these factions of Red Guards, initially they started, basically Mao canceled school, he canceled classes, all of these things that were considered feudal. Like I mentioned before, he believed that the education system was fundamentally flawed, that you didn't need a lot of what they were teaching you because it wasn't revolutionary enough, it wasn't socialist enough. So schools closed, and these Red Guards took control of the university, and it started at Tsinghua University, and it spread out amongst other universities and eventually took over the whole country. And we'll see that in a second. But these students now took control of the schools. So they began struggles, what they call struggle sessions with these teachers and administrators who they accused of being either too rightist or bourgeoisie or practicing these old ways. And there's what they call the campaign against four olds, four old ideas, old customs, old culture, and old habits. And so that anybody that was guilty of practicing any of these old habits, especially amongst the teachers, the professors, this older generation, they were thrown in these struggle sessions. These struggle sessions were oftentimes very violent, where initially it would start out as an accusation would be levied against a teacher, administrator, and then they were forced to defend themselves. And obviously, it was basically a kangaroo court, so they couldn't. So they throw them in a struggle session where they'd be surrounded, ridiculed, beaten, held out in the hot sun, and they would wear what was called dunce caps. And so they were basically humiliated into submission. And here's where things got very bad. With these Red Guards, it became an internal competition amongst themselves to find more rightists, to root out bourgeoisie in order to achieve the goals that Mao had set before them, this revolutionary idea. And so they started competing against each other to outdo one another as who could find the rightist. But also, they had to go above and beyond to prove that they weren't rightists. So it was this kind of, it had reached, I don't know what the scientific term is, but it was basically a self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, and it kept getting worse. It was like a snowball effect. As soon as it started rolling and started gaining motion here, it just avalanched and just got out of control because they were competing against one another. And if you showed any sort of hesitancy in worshiping socialism and Maoist thought and his cultural ideas, you could be accused of a rightist. And there's really no control or no way to defend yourself against these Red Guards. And it got very violent. And a lot of teachers ended up being killed during this summer of the Red Guards and their terror. And it leads into Red August.
And I think this is a good point to say, where people, so like the ideologues start the violence, and then opportunists come in and use the situation to their advantage as well. For example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, when the United States was in there, to be labeled a terrorist, if you were to go tell an American, soldier or something like that in Iraq or Afghanistan in 2004, 2005, hey, this person over here is a terrorist, that gets put into an intel apparatus, and all of a sudden there's a target package built on this person, and a drone erases them off the face of the earth in the future, right? So like, whether or not that person was a terrorist, we were pretty loosey-goosey with our definition back then. In the same way, to be labeled a rightist or an anti or a counter-revolutionary, that was, these students were going after the school teachers and administrators. But what we'll see is this creates a ripple effect across the country where people just started labeling others as rightists and counter-revolutionaries because they didn't like them. And then the mob would get a hold of them. And that's how things kind of spun out of control.
Right there, the mob mentality is what happens. Like there was no thinking organizational element at some point. It just became a mob frenzy, really. And the 5 black categories, as they called them, were landlords, rich farmers, counter-revolutionaries, quote, bad elements, kind of subversives, or opiate addict, people that were on opiates or opium, and then right-wingers, obviously. So if you were thrown into one of those counter categories, you absolutely had a target on your back, and you had to prove that you weren't, and you couldn't really prove that you weren't once you were accused. So the whole goal was, well, I just can't get accused, so I have to prove myself that I'm not one of these elements. And it's interesting when you look at the Red Guards, they proclaim to be such socialists, and they had these. There was a lot of infighting and factionalization that occurred, and it's you kind of look at it. It became like this cult of personality around Mao really did become kind of a religion, where they started fighting each other over very small splits, and they almost became separate religious sects and entities and started fighting one another. And over the next 2 years, that's what happens a lot. A lot of the bloodshed and chaos occurred because they were fighting one another as well. Because I think to your point about opportunists, they saw an opportunity to gain a foothold of power, and they needed to fill that vacuum. They also had fights amongst each other over kind of these bloodline feuds where they would argue amongst one another of who had the best bloodline, which it's kind of ironic because they want to get rid of feudalism, but that's such a feudal idea. And the whole idea of a bloodline was, well, I come from my father, my grandfather he fought in the Civil War, or he fought the Japanese during the Sino-Russian War. Those were considered the higher elements. But if your parents were landlords, then you come from a bad bloodline. So these bloodline battles, it started occurring between the Red Guards, but ultimately most of the Red Guards were children of different cadre members within the CCP, and they were educated. So they kind of already had an element of privilege, and they had a life that was not anywhere reflective of, or they had nothing in common with the peasants that lived out in the country. And we'll see later they're in for a rude awakening once the Rustification and down the countryside movement begins, but they really have no connection. So yeah.
Can I just make a quick comment on this? Is the nature of Marxism when you bifurcate all of society between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and you say that it's the role of the proletariat to rise up and usurp, when it's the role of the proletariat to rise up and take over the role of the bourgeoisie, the proletariat becomes the bourgeoisie. Then they become the very thing that they had strove to defeat. So you had these children of cadre members who, I'm sure their parents were extremely poor peasants, hanging out somewhere in the countryside. But then after the revolution, they became privileged. They're no longer Marx's definition of the proletariat. They have become the bourgeoisie, but yet they talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. It's just like this just happens over and over and over again in various Marxist societies.
That's a great point again. So Mao understood that. So I talked about this bottom up versus top down kind of idea. Liao Xiao Chi wanted to send the current party out to educate people on socialism. Well, Mao wanted these youths, this youth urban movement, to have their own revolution, because that's a key fundamental piece of Marxist-Leninism. The revolution can never stop. It's always ongoing. Well, most of the educated class at this point, if you're like 18 to 25, and that was really maybe a little younger, so like 14 to 25, that's kind of who he was targeting. You were probably not alive. You definitely weren't alive at the start of the Civil War, the fighting between the CCP and the KMT. You weren't there during the Long March. You weren't there fighting the Japanese. You may have been alive during the last couple of years of the Civil War, but you had no real revolution of your own. So you grew up kind of outside of it. So you really had nothing to say, this is my revolution. Well, Mao was giving them that with this, with this May 16th directive and documentation when he released it. And then we'll see this rally in Tiananmen Square. He made it their revolution, and he kind of utilized this frenzy of emotion in order to achieve his political goals. And that was get rid of Liao Xiao Chi and replace him with his heir apparent Lin Biao, which we'll get to in a second. So on August 18th, they call it the 8/18 rally in Tiananmen Square. There's like 300,000 Red Guards there. And I think he personally shook hands with like 1,500 of them. He gave this huge speech where he spoke directly to the Red Guards, directly to the youth, and told them to continue this revolution. And he talked about the old idea, or the four olds. And one key moment in this was when a young woman by the name of Song Bin Bin came in. She was on stage with Mao, and she put a red armband around Mao. And this was kind of a symbolic moment of Mao talking directly to one of his Red Guards, but he was showing that he was one of them. Like this armband is how they signified who the Red Guards were. And this is him showing that I'm one of you. And it just ignited this chaotic scene across the country once this occurred. But he renamed her because Bin Bin in Mandarin meant gentle. And he did not think that was in line with her personality, because she was a hardline Red Guard revolutionary. And he changed her name to Song Yao Wu, which means militant. So it goes from gentle to militant. Yeah.
Hmm.
And so so at this rally, he rails against the four olds, the five black categories, speaks directly to the Red Guards, basically says, I'm one of you. And this is where it goes from these universities where it's Red Guards against teachers. Now it's Red Guards against society as a whole. So this is where everyone now who is currently in the CCP as a party member becomes now part of the revolution, and on the receiving end of the revolution, not the revolution side. So this is what kind of spirals into where it spirals into chaos. So this revolution begins, and it starts going through the different provinces of China, and it gets out of control fast. So struggle sessions start occurring not just with teachers, but city administrators, city officials, people who are accused of being landlords or expressing feudal ideas. In last week's episode, we mentioned that during the Great Leap, a lot of these feudal ideas had retaken over ideas on marriage, Buddhism, Christianity, a lot of old, quote, old religions and ideals. Also, private property ownership kind of regained a foothold, and it still existed through the socialist education movement. And these communes were obviously reduced in size. Well, if you happen to retake up one of those feudal ideas or this private ownership, you now were probably the victim of a struggle session. And it's really sad, because at this point, it becomes kind of children versus their parents, not just students against teachers, but it becomes children versus their parents. And so you started having cases with children turning in their own parents or their own family members in order to basically keep themselves from either A, falling victim to the revolution, or because they were so caught up in this cult of personality in this revolution that they became their own. And so, like we mentioned in the key takeaways, that this revolution amongst the Red Guards, this bottom up, these urban educated youth that had now kind of taken control of most of these major cities, Mao was utilizing this to get rid of Liao Xiao Chi, Deng Xiaoping, who he thought were too moderate. And in 1967, they were placed on house arrest. The Shanghai government was taken over by extremists. Most of the country followed suit. And during 1967, it got so bad amongst with these Red Guards running rampant, A, fighting each other, B, destroying, like, city officials no longer had the ability to govern because Red Guards were operating with impunity. And so it's the reason Liao Xiaoqi and Deng Xiaoping were placed under house arrest is not, obviously Mao wanted them out, but he basically utilized the fact that they were trying to use work groups that they had organized in the socialist education movement to stop and to keep the Red Guards under control. And city officials were then held in check because they weren't able to utilize military or police force to stop the Red Guards. So these Red Guards were operating basically from Mao because they were not being punished by the military, by the police, anyone like that. So they could do whatever they wanted, really. So the only thing stopping them was themselves. So
what does that sound like? Sorry, I'm going to totally derail this conversation. What you just said, where these Red Guards are running rampant, they're creating chaos and violence, and the administrators, the local government officials were either too scared to do anything about it or saw it as politically advantageous. What does that sound like? What recent
sounds
event?
Like the utopia of Chaz.
Utopia of Chaz? Well, yeah, that's right. The Chaz.
Again, this is sort of where we need to take, in 2023, we need to take a look back 60 years and understand that this is sort of how things spiral out of control. When you allow people to form a mob mentality they're acting with impunity, people are going to start getting killed. They're going to to overrun basic society. And it's not going to be a pretty picture for most people outside of those that have guns or are armed or are operating within kind of this soft acknowledgement or soft okay from government officials, because leave no doubt, Mao definitely allowed this to happen. He could have put a stop to it, but he let it happen. And by letting it happen,
Mm-hmm.
he was
Yeah.
endorsing it. Yeah, it was a soft endorsement. That's what I should say. So kind of like in Seattle with Chaz, let's think about that. If the fact that the city didn't shut it down and say, hey, no, you're not going to just form your own little city out here, because like people were getting, there was rapes, there were robberies. I think there was a murder or two there. Like that's what happens when you have, and that was in like 2 days. In like 2 days of it existing, it was nuts.
Yeah.
Well, the city basically said it's okay because they didn't stop it. They basically gave it a soft endorsement. So, like anytime we see something like that happening, understand that as much as you may be frustrated or unhappy with the way things are, chances are it's going to get much worse if you give in to the mob. Or think about the French Revolution with the Reign of Terror. I mean,
Right.
Robespierre was the architect of that, and he
Mm-hmm.
ended up losing his head because it got so out of control that he couldn't even defend himself. So
Yeah. I really hope our listeners, I hope you guys are thinking about other points in time in which there's some universal truths here when we talk about the Cultural Revolution. I personally am just thinking about 2020 in the United States, when, like, to be labeled in the same way that to be labeled a rightist was the worst thing that could have happened to you during the Cultural Revolution, to be labeled a racist was the worst thing that could have happened to you. I'd say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but that was the worst thing that could have happened to you. So, and the only way to prove that you were a rightist, or the only way to prove that you were a racist, was to like publicly go out there and perform like these apologetic, like there were people who were falling all over themselves to prove like, oh, I'm not a racist, like I'm an anti-racist, like oh, you know,
I'm
the
not a
Robin
rightist, I'm
DiAngelos
an
of the world.
anti-rightist.
Right. And I only bring this up to say we as Americans, I won't even throw the broad term of Westerners, like we as Americans need to be very careful when we look at what happened in China and go like, oh, that could have never happened here. Because in many sense, or in many regards, it did. Now, there's obviously very clear differences. One, millions didn't die in 2020. I mean, people died, but not even remotely close to what happened in the Cultural Revolution. So, like, it was obviously different in some key ways. The seeds of the same chaos occurred in 2020 here in the United States as they did in 1966
Another
in
point on
China.
top of that is, just because it didn't happen then, the seeds were planted and it started. Just because it didn't break out as badly doesn't mean it can't happen again. Like the summer of 2020
Dude.
happened. Like if you were to tell somebody in 2019 that was going to happen 1 year from then, that's what it would be like. Nobody would have believed you. Like all it takes,
Maybe not quite to the
right.
scale that it happened
But
in
the fact
2020.
that it kind of started to happen, not nearly as bad, but the fact that it did happen doesn't mean, and just because we look at it and we're like, okay, well, it wasn't as bad as the Cultural Revolution. Whew, we're good. We don't need to worry about it. Like that's kind of the wrong attitude to have. What I think I'm trying to say is you need to stay vigilant against this sort of thing and understand the signs and read the room of what's happening in order to stop it.
Right.
Not necessarily to like, you don't want to be like, go full authoritarian and be like, no dissent, you can't dissent. You can't say anything bad about this group or the government or anything like that. That's not what we're saying. We're simply saying like turning it over to the mob to find some sort of, for
politically advantageous situation.
Exactly. Yeah. There's always somebody that's going to gain favor from it. And chances are your average person, like the average person or the average Red Guard in China, was probably no better off a few years. And actually, for them, a few years after this kicked off, like they were no better off. As a matter of fact, they might have been worse off. So just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think the key lesson. Sorry, one last comment. One last comment, then you can rein it back in. The key takeaway in my analogy here is, when the government doesn't condemn the mob will keep going, right? So as we see here, Mao had to rein back in his own Red Guards 2 years later. Fast forward to the end of the Cultural Revolution in the late 70s and in the early 80s, the CCP straight up came and said, like, yo, we made some mistakes in the Cultural Revolution. This shouldn't have happened. As it stands today, 3 years after 2020, excuse me, 3 years after 2020 in the United States, I have not heard a single left-wing politician come out and condemn the riots and what was going on in 2020. Now, something probably could be said about January 6th. Don't want to go into that right now. But the fact of the matter remains is if we don't condemn mob violence, the mob will keep going. So I'll stop there.
It's very true. Now, before we get into how Mao reined this in, I do want to go through some of the key players and how he kind of orchestrated this. Because like we said, he's Liao Xiao Chi and Deng Xiaoping kind of sidelined him during the socialist education movement. Obviously, they're under house arrest. So who did he bring in order to orchestrate and run this cultural revolution? Because like I said, he wasn't in control, but he was in charge. And there were some people that were at the very, very top in his inner circle that were feeding this revolution and making sure that it was kind of this chaos was rumbling, at least in the direction that they wanted to. They may not be able to control every little thing, but they can kind of keep it moving. That makes it politically advantageous for them to keep this cult of personality and this fanatical worship of Mao going. So he had the Gang of Four, which interestingly enough, his fourth wife, Jiang Qing, who was a former actress. As a matter of fact, there's some thought that she might have actually been a KMT agent back in the 30s because she had some ties to Chiang Kai-shek. That's neither here nor there. But the fact that she was a former actress and, she had some obvious ties and understood culture. And so she had three other members who were Zheng Shunqiao, Yao Wenwan, and Wang Hongwen. That is a butchered Anglo version of the Wade Phillips transliteration. I'm very sorry. Doing my best here to go through some of these pronunciations. So feel free to correct me in the comments or anything like that. But that was his cultural inner circle. So these Gang of Four, they were the ones that pushed for a movement to redesign the way operas, the arts were set up, structured, in the message that they conveyed. If you remember the opera that was obviously so roundly criticized initially, Hai Ru dismissed from office, it was too bourgeoisie. Well, they wanted the arts now to be simple, black and white. Basically, the proletariat good, bourgeoisie bad. It had to be a simple message that praised the state, praised the revolution, praised the proletariat. They pushed for this across culture. Well, then he also had Lin Biao, who I mentioned before. During this time, Lin Biao was the defense minister, and he becomes Mao's heir apparent once Liao Xiao Chi falls out of favor and is under house arrest. He was the one responsible, if you remember from last week, putting the little red book as a required reading for the military, the ones that had to memorize Maoist thought, the cult of personality. That was almost more, or it was more important than military training. This is the ideological training within the military. And that made the PLA fanatically loyal to Mao, not the state, not any sort of constitution like it is in the United States. They were loyal to Mao. They were his army under the direction of Lin Biao.
And to this day, the PLA has political commissars at every branch of their military. They're all over the place. It's a very prestigious position.
Yeah. If you remember from the movie, it's a great movie, by the way, Enemy at the Gates. Obviously, there's Jude Law, the good-looking sniper, the hero of the whole thing. And then there's the other guy. I can't remember the actor's name, but he was the political officer. He didn't do any of the fighting, but he was the one that was like, yeah, from Mother Russia. And that's a political officer. That's kind of what they do. They don't really do much fighting, but they make sure that the rank and file soldiers, the ones pulling the triggers, are pulling the trigger for the right person. They keep people ideologically and loyal to that ideology.
Right. Well, the Marxists know there's just something about the military that across all cultures and across time, the military tends to be a conservative institution. I say tends to be because that doesn't mean that the individuals that make up the military, especially here in the United States. A very common misunderstanding is that, oh, you're in the military, you must be a Republican. That's not true at all.
More
But
than
generally
likely, but
speaking,
it's not. You're more than likely, but it's still like it's not
generally
like
speaking, they're
99.
conservatives, right?
Yeah, you're not like I found one guy out of 100 who's a Democrat. It's not quite that ratio.
Yeah. It's, yeah. So Marxists, both the Russian Marxists and the Chinese Marxists, knew that if you're a leftist political entity, in order to keep the military where it needs to be, you got to put your political people, your political commissars in the military. That's honestly, that's the number one reason why they're there.
It kind of harkens, and I don't want to go on another, but like the fear of the military from any sort of regime kind of goes back to Rome. If you've ever studied like Roman history, which I recommend for everybody because it's fascinating, like everyone talks about the Praetorian Guard and these armies. Well, armies in Rome were loyal to the general that they served if they were a good one. If they weren't a good general, the army would just kill them. But they were loyal to them, and armies started marching on Rome. Generals would be like, I want to be the emperor, especially during the crisis of the 3rd century. They'd be like, I want to be the general. Or the Praetorian Guard would be like, hey, you're the emperor, pay us a lot of money. Otherwise, we're going to kill you like we did your predecessor. So that's kind of where the fear of the military constantly, because if you have an army, you can run a country, or you can lose a country.
Even, and not to jump too far ahead here, but here in the Cultural Revolution, like Lin Biao becomes Mao's number 2 guy after Liao Xiao Chi kind of falls out of favor. And Lin Biao was a military guy. And fast forward, Lin Biao eventually falls out of favor because he has too strong of a grasp over the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So Mao feels threatened by him, and he needs to get rid of him. So it's super pertinent to the Cultural Revolution too.
Per official Chinese sources, he died fleeing in an attempting to flee to the USSR, but he was killed by Mao. Everybody knows it. He was killed by Mao.
Yeah, there's reason. There's questionable circumstances for sure.
Yeah, definitely questionable. Anyway, so let's bring it back into Cultural Revolution. So, all right, so we're entering about year 2 of the Cultural Revolution, and things are chaotic. There's reports of cannibalism in the Guangxi province, where like the beatings and ritualistic struggle sessions got so out of hand that there was cannibalism. So Mao says, okay, I've purged Liao Xiao Chi, Deng Xiaoping, even though he's still in the party, he's under house arrest, he's sidelined. I have the people that I want in control. I've got my Gang of 4 influencing culture. I've got Lin Biao running the military, who is fanatically loyal to Mao at this point. He's also got Chen Boda and Kang Sheng in charge of security and ideology. Basically, his muscle men to kind of enforce things to make sure that the party stays in line. I don't know if you've ever read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I always think of like Kang Sheng as like Cuffy Mings. If you remember that character, that's kind of who I see it as, just sort of this kind of brooding like security guy. He doesn't really do much ideologically, but he like just makes sure that you toe whatever his boss says.
He's the muscle.
He's the muscle. He's not the brains. He's the muscle. And he trained under the Soviet secret police. So I'm not saying he was like a dumb guy, but he's not paid or wasn't in a position in order to think about Marxism and Leninism. He was paid and put in a position of power to make sure you abided by it. Anyway, so he's got the people he believes are truly socialist revolutionaries, and he can control in power at the very top. The bottom obviously has been, quote, cleansing itself of any bourgeoisie and rightists, but now he's got a country to run. And, one of the metrics to show that what a fall off had happened, we talked about from like 56 to 58, there's a 30% decline in GDP. Well, from 66 to 68, there's a 12% decline in GDP. So even though there wasn't a mass starvation like there was during the Great Leap, there was definitely an economic setback. Mind you, if you remember 2 episodes ago where we started talking about kind of what was going on around China, they obviously had broken from the USSR. There was almost a war in 68 with USSR, and the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia. So Mao is looking around as he's pissed off all of his neighbors, Vietnam, USSR, India, because they invaded India in 1962. So he has no real friends. So he's like, okay, we've got to get the country back under control. Lin Biao and the PLA take over the country, and they began running the country from a military standpoint. It's basically a military occupied era, military occupation from like 68 to 71. So the PLA is in control of the country in order to, ironically, cleanse itself of the Red Guards and get things back under control. So that brings us to this other point with what to do with the Red Guards now. You have these fanatics who worship Mao. You can't just, there's too many of them. You can't just get rid of them. Well, let's take that socialist fervor and put it in practice. Well, it's what's called the down the countryside movement, or rustification, where he basically took millions of these young, educated Red Guards and pushed them out into the countryside. It's ironic. And, the idea behind it was, well, we're going to teach you some skills. We're going to teach you to be in the struggle with your brothers, these peasant class. Because Mao, even though he was a teacher and an educator, he got his start in his base of power from the peasants in the countryside in the late 20s and 30s. So he has this affinity for the peasants in the countryside. So he sends these Red Guards out to the countryside. And within a socialist society, like, there's not really room for like division of labor and specialization. Like, that's a very capitalist, industrialist mindset, where it's like, hey, my job is to, like, I do one thing on the assembly line, but I do it really well. Like, for socialists and Marxists, it's like, I need to do a lot of little things as like a peasant. I'm not a specialized worker in this industrial machine. I'm a farmer. So you have to have a lot of these different skills. Ironically enough, none of them had these skills to survive out on the farms, the hinterland of China. So you send all of these, imagine it now, sending like a 23-year-old Ivy Leaguer to say, hey, you're going to go work on a pig farm in Iowa. And they just sent him out there with nothing. It's like, hey, go take your books, go out to a farm in Iowa and start working on a pig farm.
Bro, if anybody has baled hay before, that was going out and baling hay. Like, that will make you question your manhood.
It will.
It's like, holy crap, this sucks.
I always found that
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just thinking about, like, as you were talking, it's like, wait a minute, I'm probably one of these more privileged, educated folks. It's like, what have I done that's hard in my life? And it's like, oh man, I baled hay once. Like, that freaking sucked.
I have some family members, and I said a pig farm in Iowa, but I have some family members who work. They're farmers in the Midwest, and I just remember talking to my cousin one time, and it's like early in the morning. He was like, "Yeah, I was out with. There was a problem in one of the barns with the animals." He was like, "I was out there till like 2 a.m. and like I saw him at like 8 a.m. the next morning. He was just like covered in mud, and he was just like, "Yeah, I had to stay out there." And that's the thing. It's like, otherwise, like, your livelihood, that's your livelihood right there. You don't really have a choice. It's not like, well, I'm going to go to sleep. The union says I only have to work this many hours. It's like, well, no, if you want to survive, you're going to be out here. And I just remember thinking, like, yeah, it's kind of a hard life. Like, it is very physically demanding. I always just found it ironic that, like, a lot of it's always like children of high privilege that have never really done that. Like, if you look at their hands, there's no calluses. They have all sorts of different issues. Like, they couldn't do it. But they are always the ones championing it, or on the Voice of the Champions. Well, this is putting it in practice, this rustification. It doesn't end badly. So they go out there thinking they're going to be bookkeepers and educators. Well, they're like, well, we already have a town teacher. Like, we don't need here's a shovel. Go start digging. We got to, we got to start planting before the rainy season. Like, get out there and start doing some backbreaking labor.
Yeah.
And it actually successfully diffused a lot of the Red Guards. The Red Guard movement, it successfully diffused it. It also kind of led off. After the Great Leap Forward, there was too much urbanization within China. So it kind of eased the strain on cities, because you just sent millions of people, especially the young ones who probably tend to crowd in cities a little bit more. So you sent them out to the countryside. You've diffused this political mob that has been causing chaos for the last 2 years. You still have their support, but they're out in the countryside. You have your loyal defense minister running the PLA in charge of the country. So things are good. Before we wrap up, there's one quote I'm going to read from Mao about this down the countryside movement. It is very necessary for the educated youth to go to the countryside to be re-educated by the poor and the lower middle-class peasants. Cadres and other people in the cities should be persuaded to send their sons and daughters who have completed junior or senior middle school, college, or university to the countryside. Let us mobilize comrades throughout the countryside should welcome them. So this is him basically de-radicalizing the Red Guards and sending them out. And he kind of appealed to them in their sense of communism and socialism. So I think it's probably a good stopping point with the successful diffusion of the Red Guards and the PLA taking control of the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting example in Chinese history as someone as politically skillful as Mao, recognizing that his own movement was kind of getting out of control and that he needed to get the Red Guards to kind of go away. It almost reminds me of the current government under Xi Jinping with their COVID protocols. It was like zero COVID. Oh, some riots and some protests are breaking out in the country. Up, like, hey, we're opening back up, guys. Like, thank you, Xi Jinping and third party observer. It's like, wait a minute, like, you reversed course, and nobody did anybody notice that? So
they know better.
Mao is somewhat. Yeah, they know better, which is exactly what's going on. Is Mao did the exact same thing. So him sending the Red Guards and students out in the countryside was a clever way to get stability back.
He was evil, but I'll give it to him. He was very politically deft. I mean, he's diffused dissent within his own ranks several times. He's dispatched people that he deemed to be a little too power hungry. I mean, he is politically deft, if anything. Evil, but politically deft.
Yeah. I mean, they all were. Hitler, Stalin, Mao, like the top three evil dudes in the last 100 years, they were all very smart, politically speaking. So anyway. All right. So I think we've got to a good stopping point here in the first third of the Cultural Revolution. This was the main radical phase. In our next episode, we're gonna bring in the Americans. And one reason why we didn't talk too much about like American politics in this episode was, and we'll talk more in detail in the next episode, the United States, like the LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, and the Nixon administration was completely clueless that this was all going on. Well, in 1970, 71, the U.S. and China start making overtures, and that was right after this radical phase of the Cultural Revolution. So on our next episode, we're gonna bring in the United States. We're gonna bring in how the rapprochement got started, and we're gonna also talk about how that worked with the later years of the Cultural Revolution and how those two things fed off of one another. Break. Is there anything else you want to say? Cool. Break. So we really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, please give us a 5-star rating and type out that review for us. If you give us a 5-star review, we'll give you a shout out here on the episode. You can find us on social media. You can tell us what you want to see next. Tell us what we're still deliberating on the next series. Have no idea how much longer we're going to be in China-U.S. relations. It'll be a minute because there's some good stuff on Taiwan that we haven't even touched yet. So let us know what you guys want us to cover next. We tend to try to cover historical topics that have significance for today, that better help us understand what's going on today. That's kind of our brand, or at least we're trying to be that brand. So you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're also on YouTube. You can give us some feedback there. And yeah, thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next week on the Loins of History. See ya.